The snow came down sideways, sharp as broken glass, and Caleb Thorne couldn't tell where the trail ended anymore. He stopped anyway. Not because it was safe, but because his lungs were burning and his legs were shaking in that deep, hollow way that meant he'd pushed past sense. The Sawtooth Mountains rose around him like a wall of teeth, gray and merciless, their peaks swallowed by cloud. Wind tore through the pass, ripping sound out of the world until there was nothing left but breath snow and the crunch of boots on stone. Colt stood a few feet ahead, leash slack, body angled into the wind. The dog turned his graying muzzle back toward Caleb, eyes steady as if asking a simple question. "Are we still doing this?" Caleb tightened his grip on the straps of his pack. 40 pounds. Too much for this elevation for October for a man who hadn't done anything harder than walking from his car to an office building in years. "Yeah," he said aloud, though his voice vanished as soon as it left his mouth. "We're still doing it." He checked the map again. Paper thin. Hand-drawn. The ink faded to the color of old bruises. It showed no trail names, no elevation markers, no landmarks that matched anything on the Forest Service maps he'd studied obsessively the week before. Just contour lines, a rough sketch of a ridgeline, and a small X tucked into a bowl-shaped valley high above timberline. Next to the X, written in careful slanted handwriting, were 2 words. "Go home." A gust nearly knocked him sideways. He staggered, caught himself with a gloved hand against a boulder slick with ice, and laughed once, sharp and humorless. Home. He hadn't had one of those in a long time. 3 weeks earlier, Caleb had been standing in a fluorescent-lit conference room in Boise, Idaho, watching his manager explain budget cuts with the kind of calm, practiced voice people used when they wanted to seem kind while doing something final. Last hired, first let go. No hard feelings. He'd nodded, shaken hands, packed his desk into a cardboard box, and walked out without feeling much of anything at all. That scared him more than anger would have. The divorce papers came 2 days later. No shouting, no cheating. Just a quiet, exhausted agreement that whatever they'd been trying to build together had collapsed under its own weight. His ex-wife had cried. He hadn't. He watched her leave their townhouse with a suitcase and realized distantly that he didn't know how to explain why he felt relief instead of grief. By the time he drove north to his grandmother's old cabin to sort through her things, he felt hollow. Like something essential had been scooped out of him and never replaced. The cabin smelled like cedar and dust and time. It sat alone at the edge of a clearing miles from the nearest paved road, a place his grandmother had retreated to every summer until her health failed. Caleb had spent childhood weekends there, bored and restless, counting the hours until they went back to town. Now, standing in the silence, he couldn't imagine why he'd ever wanted to leave. He found the trunk on the second day. Old, oak, iron-banded. It took effort to pry it open, the hinges stiff with rust. Inside were folded quilts, yellowed letters tied with twine, and at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, the map. He recognized the handwriting immediately. His grandmother's. She had pressed the map into his hands, in the hospital fingers, cold and trembling eyes, sharp even then. He remembered leaning close to hear her whisper. "Don't lose this," she'd said. "You'll know when it's time." He hadn't understood. He hadn't asked. He wished he had. The wind eased as suddenly as it had risen. Caleb lifted his head, heart pounding, and realized he'd crested the last false summit. The valley opened below him. It wasn't dramatic at first glance. Just a shallow bowl, cradled between ridges dotted with scrub and frost-silvered grass. But something about it pulled at him, a quiet insistence that had nothing to do with logic. Colt whined softly and started down the slope, careful but eager. Caleb followed. As he descended, the temperature seemed to shift. Not warmer exactly, just different. The wind slid over the bowl instead of knifing through it. Snow settled instead of stinging, and then he saw the stone. Low walls rose from the earth like bones surfacing through skin. Fitted granite blocks, gray and massive, some still standing shoulder high. Others collapsed into rough lines half buried in turf. The remains of a structure, maybe several, arranged with a purpose that time hadn't fully erased. An abandoned settlement, high and forgotten. Caleb stopped at the edge of it, breath caught somewhere between awe and unease. He'd grown up in the West. He'd seen old homesteads, mining shacks, rusted-out dreams scattered across the mountains. This was different. The stones were too precise, too intentional. Colt stepped forward and pressed his shoulder against Caleb's leg the way he did when thunderstorms rolled in or when something unseen made him nervous or excited. Caleb had never been good at telling the difference. "I know," he murmured, though he wasn't sure what he meant. He walked the perimeter slowly. One structure stood apart from the rest, backed against the rising slope of the mountain. 3 walls remained tall and solid. The 4th was gone entirely, opening toward the south, where late afternoon light spilled into the valley. Caleb stepped inside. The sound changed immediately. The wind dropped to a low murmur like breath through a doorway. The cold lost its edge. He stood very still, letting the sensation register the way you did when you stepped into a room and realized you were alone when you hadn't expected to be, or not alone at all. He unshouldered his pack and set it down, hands suddenly unsteady. Colt circled once, then lay down against the western wall with a sigh, tail thumping once against stone. Caleb laughed under his breath. "Guess we're staying the night," he said. He pitched his small tent in the corner, where 2 walls met, anchoring it with rocks instead of stakes. As the light faded, the stone seemed to hold on to what little warmth the day had offered, releasing it slowly, patiently, like it had been waiting for something to return. He made a small fire near the opening, cooked a packet of dehydrated stew, and ate without much appetite. The exhaustion settled into him heavy and deep. Before crawling into his sleeping bag, he pulled the map from his jacket pocket one last time. The X sat exactly where he was. "Go home." He folded the map carefully and tucked it under his pillow. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft this time. Inside the shelter of ancient walls, Caleb lay awake, listening to the quiet, to Colt's steady breathing, to the strange sense that the place around him wasn't abandoned at all. Somewhere in the stone, something waited, and in the morning he was going to start looking for it. The snow had eased sometime after midnight, leaving a thin white skin over the valley floor. Caleb awoke just before dawn, breath clouding the cold air inside his tent. He hadn't slept well, not from discomfort, but from a feeling he couldn't name, like someone had been standing just outside the tent flap, watching, listening. Colt was already awake, ears pricked, body still, gaze focused on the stone opening that faced south. He hadn't growled, hadn't barked. Whatever he sensed, it hadn't felt like danger. Just presence. Caleb pushed the flap aside and stepped out into the ruined structure. His boots crunched over frost-hardened grass and patches of snow. The wind had changed overnight. Softer now, almost gentle. But the strangest thing was the warmth. Not warmth like a heater or fire, but the absence of biting cold. Standing in the center of the old stone walls, Caleb felt a few degrees of difference, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. He held out a hand, slowly moved toward the northern wall, then the southern opening. The contrast was clear. Inside, tolerable. Outside, bitter, sharp mountain cold. He stepped back inside and muttered to himself, "The wind screams everywhere except in here." Colt shifted his weight as if agreeing. It didn't make sense. He knew the concept of thermal mass. He'd skimmed an article about it once, back when he still read things without finishing them. But these were ruins. No roof. Just 3 standing walls and some stones half swallowed by time. How could they still work? He circled the interior slowly, fingers trailing along the surface of the granite. The blocks were huge, uneven, but expertly fitted. No cement. No visible binding, just stone set into stone, mortared with something that had hardened into earth itself. Even now, after what must have been 100 years or more, it held. The south wall gone completely, had once opened to sunlight. Caleb stepped into the doorway and looked out. The valley rolled out below, bathed in pale morning light. Aspen trees painted gold patches of red brush scattered like embers across the slope. Far in the distance, fog clung to the ridgelines like smoke slowly lifting. The placement was intentional. This wasn't a random ruin. It was oriented. Eleanor knew what she was doing. He said her name out loud for the first time. Eleanor Holt. It felt strange on his tongue. Formal. Familiar. He said it again, quieter. She'd written the journal he found last night, tucked into a hollow between two stones under what remained of a hearth. The leather was cracked pages, stiff and yellowed, but her handwriting still held shape. Neat, measured, controlled. She hadn't written much. Short entries, observations, sentences that stopped halfway through as if she'd been interrupted and never finished the thought. But the tone was unmistakable. Eleanor had loved this place, fiercely. She'd called the walls bones, said the mountain had memory. Caleb pulled the journal from his coat pocket and flipped to the page he'd dog-eared before sleep. The wind breaks against the stone, but it doesn't get in. It listens. It leaves. People think I'm crazy for staying, but this place, this structure was made with understanding. The mountain is cruel to the careless, but if you build right, it keeps you. He closed the book and stood in the opening again. Something stirred at the edge of thought. Not quite belief, but curiosity, and maybe something older than that. Respect. He spent the rest of the morning exploring the ruins. There were 6 structures in total. 3 collapsed into heaps, 1 nearly erased by vegetation, 2 with partial walls still standing. Only the one he'd slept in felt intact, not in a literal sense, but in spirit, as if it had been preserved not by time but by intention. Colt followed him through the ruins, occasionally stopping to sniff at foundations or paw at the dirt where something had once been buried, now long gone. Near the eastern edge of the settlement, Caleb found the remains of what might have been a root cellar, just a depression in the earth, ringed with stones and half filled with dead leaves. He crouched beside it, brushed away debris. Who had built this? Not just Eleanor. She'd found this place. That much was clear from her writing. But someone had come before her. Maybe long before. And Eleanor, she'd stayed. That part haunted him more than anything. In the journal, she never said why. Only that the valley hadn't been home. Only that something about this place held her. Caleb walked back to the main structure and stood in the center of the open room. He turned a slow circle. West wall, north wall, eastern edge crumbling, south completely open. The way the sun poured in at this angle, it wasn't random. This was survival built like belief. Eleanor had said something else in one of her entries. He flipped back. I built against the bones, not over them, not in spite of them, with them. You don't fight the mountain. You fold yourself into it. Caleb sat down on a flat stone colt resting at his feet. There was something sacred about the way this ruin was holding itself up. The silence inside wasn't empty. It felt shaped, as if the stones held not just heat, but memory. Something left behind, something waiting to be found. That word again, waiting. He wasn't sure if it was the place waiting for him, or him waiting for the place. The rest of the day passed in quiet work. He reinforced the tent with heavier rocks, checked his remaining food, rationed the firewood he'd hauled up from the tree line. And then he began sketching. Using the backside of Eleanor's map, he started drawing the layout of the ruins. Measurements, sun angles, wall heights, a crude but growing map of the place. Not just to understand it, but to remember it, in case it tried to fade again. By the time the sun dropped behind the western peaks, the air had grown sharp, slicing down from the upper ridges. He lit his fire again and warmed his hands. The sky overhead glowed in deep blues and orange streaks. A hawk circled once far above Silent. Colt shifted beside him and huffed softly. Caleb reached down and scratched behind his ears. "You think she stayed because it was safer here?" The dog didn't move. Or because no one told her who to be. That felt closer to the truth. He leaned back against the stone wall, staring into the fire, letting the warmth soak in. He wasn't ready to leave. Not tomorrow. Maybe not ever. But if he was going to stay, he needed to understand what Eleanor had understood. Needed to know how she'd survived not just the weather, but the solitude. She'd left a trace. And maybe more than that. A line from her journal echoed in his mind, almost too quiet to catch. The truth is still here. Hidden. Waiting. You'll know it by the stone that doesn't belong. He looked up at the western wall where the base met the frozen earth. Tomorrow he'd start looking. The wind woke him before the light did. It whispered through the broken stone like a voice too tired to raise itself above a breath. Caleb lay still inside the tent, eyes open, listening to the old bones of the ruin speak to the dark. Colt shifted beside him, but didn't stir fully, his breathing slow, steady, trusting. The fire had long since burned out. The air was sharp with cold, biting at the tip of Caleb's nose, but it didn't push all the way in. The stone still held the previous day's warmth like a memory reluctant to let it go. He pushed himself upright and lit the small camp lantern. Outside the tent flap, the sky was just beginning to lift from black to gray. The journal lay beside his sleeping bag, right where he'd left it. He hesitated, then picked it up. His hands shook slightly, whether from cold or something else, he wasn't sure. The leather cover creaked as he opened it. Page by page, he worked through the sparse entries. Most were brief weather seasonal shifts, small notations about animal tracks or firewood usage. But then midway through the book, he found it. A longer passage, still clipped but packed with weight. The mountain doesn't forgive. It remembers. That sentence hit like a bell inside his ribs. Eleanor had lived in these mountains for decades. Not just endured, lived. There was a difference. Her journal didn't read like someone hiding. It read like someone building. Someone watching. Someone paying close attention. The stone holds what we give it, she'd written on the next page. Shelter, fire, silence, sorrow. It doesn't judge. It just keeps. If we're careful, it gives something back. Caleb ran his fingers along the edge of the paper. He'd come here without knowing why, without expecting anything. A map from a dead woman he barely remembered, a whisper on a deathbed, 2 words, go home. And now he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing inside something more than just an old ruin. He was standing inside a message. He stood and stepped outside. The morning air caught in his lungs. Colt padded beside him as he crossed the open floor of the ruin and approached the western wall, the one Eleanor had mentioned in the final line he remembered from last night. Look for the stone that doesn't belong. It wasn't metaphor. It was instruction. The wall was solid fitted stone with no mortar, just perfect angles and weight. But near the base, where frost clung in shaded patches and lichen curled over the joints, Caleb found it. A stone the color of rusted iron. All the other stones were gray granite. This one was reddish, finer-grained. Sandstone, maybe. Out of place clearly, but it had been cut to the same size, fitted with the same care. If you weren't looking, you'd miss it. He crouched and ran his fingers along the edges. It wobbled slightly under pressure. His heart started to hammer. Colt let out a low whine and pressed closer to his side. Caleb braced himself and pulled. The stone came free with a soft scraping sound. Behind it was darkness. He angled the lantern down. A cavity about the size of a bread box opened behind the wall. Dry. Clean. And inside something wrapped in oilcloth. Caleb reached in, heart pounding. He withdrew the bundle and carried it back to the tent. Sitting cross-legged, he peeled the cloth back. Papers. 47 of them, maybe more. Each one folded, yellowed but intact. Handwriting covered every surface. Tight, precise. Ink faded but still legible. The first page bore a name, Margaret Holt, 1892. Eleanor's sister. He opened the letter, unfolded it slowly. Dearest Eleanor, the valley talks about you still. They say you've lost your mind living up there among ghosts and silence. I tell them they never knew you. I tell them you were never afraid of being alone, you were afraid of being caged. Those are different fears, and only one of them kills slowly. Caleb stopped reading and stared at the page. This wasn't just correspondence. It was testimony. Life written in fragments. Proof that Eleanor hadn't just isolated herself, she'd stayed connected. Someone had known her, believed her, loved her. He read letter after letter. Margaret spoke of their mother of life in the valley of droughts and influenza, of neighbors, whispering Eleanor's name with equal parts fear and awe. But mostly, she spoke of respect. I think you found something the rest of us forgot existed, one letter said. I envy you even when I miss you. Maybe especially then. The letters spanned almost 30 years, through 2 wars, multiple failed harvests, fires, epidemics, all while Eleanor remained up here surviving, thriving. And then Caleb found a passage in a letter dated January 1908. The secret Eleanor wrote in her reply, copied in Margaret's hand, is not fighting the mountain. It's learning what the mountain already knows. Mass absorbs heat, stone blocks wind, the south-facing gap catches light. Build with that, and you can burn half the wood and sleep twice as warm. It was practical, tactical, but something else underpinned it, a philosophy almost, a reverence for place, for adapting to the world instead of trying to force it to bend. He read for hours, notes piling beside him, time sliding by unnoticed. Outside, snow began to fall again, light and soft. Colt slept with his head on Caleb's boot. It wasn't until the last few letters that something new emerged. Mentions of a visitor, an old man who came in summer, a friend, a teacher. Someone from the valley but not of it, an elder. He showed me where the water runs, even in winter, Eleanor wrote. Taught me the plants that still grow under frost. Said the wind has voices and the stone remembers names. Caleb reread that line 3 times. The wind has voices. The stone remembers names. He closed his eyes. There was more to this place than survival. It was memory. Living, breathing memory held in granite and snow and silence. And Eleanor had left it here deliberately, for someone who might come after. Caleb didn't know yet if that person was him, but he was starting to wonder. And if this elder still had family out there, maybe they knew more. Tomorrow, he'd leave the ruin for a day. Head east, follow the slope, look for signs of life. Someone had helped Eleanor stay alive in this place. Maybe someone still knew why. Maybe someone else had heard the voices in the wind. The trail east of the ruins wasn't marked, but it was there, faint, hidden under wind-blown snow, and old pine needles winding along the slope like something remembered rather than made. Caleb followed it on instinct more than intention, Colt trotting ahead, nose low, tail wagging with quiet purpose. The air had warmed slightly since sunrise, and the snow had melted in patches where sunlight touched the earth. It made the path feel like it was slowly waking up after a long sleep. He kept thinking about the letters, about Eleanor, about the man she wrote of, the one who had come from the valley every summer, who had shown her things she never could have learned on her own. Someone who had known the land in ways she'd only begun to understand. And now Caleb needed to understand too. He needed more than fragments. He needed connection. 2 hours later, Colt stopped cold. His ears went forward, body alert. Not alarmed, curious. Caleb rounded a bend in the trail and saw a thin column of smoke rising above the tree line. A cabin, maybe a quarter-mile off. Wooden, weathered, roof patched with sheet metal and bark. Not abandoned. There was an axe sunk into a stump outside and a trail of boot prints in the snow, fresh as breath. Colt waited for his cue. "Go slow," Caleb said, and they approached together. A figure stepped out from behind the cabin just as they reached the clearing. Older man, thick beard, streaks of white in his hair. He wore a canvas jacket with duct tape over the elbows and held a rifle loosely in one hand, not raised, not threatening. Just ready. "Didn't expect company," the man said. His voice was dry and low, not unfriendly, not welcoming either. Caleb raised both hands slightly. "I'm not here to cause trouble. Just passing through." The man looked him up and down, eyes lingering on the pack, the dog, the tired lines in Caleb's face. "You don't look like someone who's just passing through." Caleb hesitated, then shrugged. "Yeah, maybe not." They stood in silence for a beat. Then the man nodded once and jerked his chin toward the cabin. "You hungry inside?" The air smelled like coffee and pine. A small cast-iron stove radiated steady heat. The man poured 2 tin cups and set one in front of Caleb without asking how he liked it. They sat at opposite ends of a rough wooden table. Colt curled up near the stove, immediately at ease. Caleb sipped the coffee and studied the man's face, creased, tanned, marked by a life spent more with wind and fire than people. "You live up here year-round, most of the time," the man said. "Sometimes I go down for ammo. Salt, bourbon." He smirked. "Name's Tommy Greaves, Caleb Thorne." Tommy nodded like he already knew that. "You're the one sleeping in the stone bones up on the ridge." Caleb stiffened a little. "You've been watching me," Tommy raised a brow. "You think a man lives out here without knowing who's on the mountain?" Caleb didn't answer. Just sipped the coffee. It burned in a good way. "I'm not here to ruin anything," he said quietly. "I didn't come looking for ghosts or gold." "No, Tommy said you came looking for something that doesn't have a name." Caleb looked up sharply. Tommy met his gaze without blinking. "You're not the first one the mountain tried to break." The room went still. Caleb set the cup down slowly. "What does that mean?" Tommy leaned back in his chair. "People don't come up here unless they've lost something, or they're about to. Some of them want quiet. Some want answers. Most don't find either. And Eleanor Holt." Tommy's eyes narrowed slightly. "You know her name. She was my great-great-grandmother." That got a reaction. Just a flicker. But real. "I found her journal, her letters, the ruin. I'm trying to understand why she stayed." Tommy rubbed a hand down his beard, exhaled hard. "She was tougher than any man I've met up here. Smarter, too. She knew the land, respected it, didn't try to fight it like most people do. Caleb nodded. She mentioned someone an elder, taught her things, plants, weather, stones. Tommy tilted his head. You want to find him? I want to find anyone who still remembers her. Tommy was quiet for a long time. Then he stood and pulled a crate from beneath a bench by the window. Inside were old Tin's maps, a few brittle black and white photos. He dug out a photo and passed it across the table. 3 people stood in front of a stone wall, one of them clearly Eleanor, younger than Caleb, expected her hair tied back, eyes like steel. Beside her, a tall indigenous man with a carved walking stick. The third was a child, maybe 8, dark hair in braids. The man's name was Red Elk, Tommy said, from the Shoshone Bannock tribe, used to come every summer. The girl's his granddaughter. What happened to them? They moved south in the late 40s. Reservation land got cut again. But last I heard, that girl still comes back sometimes. Caleb's heart kicked. You know where she is? Not exactly, Tommy said. But I've seen smoke near Coldwater Creek the last couple years. Summer only. Someone camping, maybe living up there part-time. Caleb folded the photo and slid it into his coat pocket. I need to find her. Tommy studied him again, then nodded once. You're not here for a story, are you? No, Caleb said. I think I'm here for a blueprint. Tommy stood and walked to a shelf, grabbed a faded wool blanket, folded it, and handed it to Caleb. You'll need this when the real cold sets in. And some advice, yeah. If you're gonna stay in that ruin, fix the roof, and don't waste heat trying to fight the wind. Block it. Let the stone do the rest. I read that in Eleanor's notes, Caleb said. Tommy smiled faintly. She wasn't wrong. They stepped outside into the afternoon light. The sky had cleared enough to see the jagged white caps of the far peaks. Caleb turned to go. Colt already trotting toward the trail. Tommy called after him. Hey. Caleb stopped. When you find her, Red Elk's granddaughter, tell her some of us still remember. Caleb gave a slow nod. I will. As he headed back toward the ruins, the air sharpened again, warning of an early snow coming in fast. He looked back once. Tommy had already gone inside. Smoke curled steady from the chimney. That night, Caleb lay in his tent, Eleanor's journal beside him, the photo tucked safely away. Outside, the wind shifted direction. He could feel it moving through the pass, circling down toward the valley. Tomorrow he would follow the smoke. And maybe, just maybe, someone would be waiting. The cold had returned by morning, hard, dry, and silent. Caleb stood at the western wall again, kneeling in front of the hollow space he'd uncovered days before. The stone Colt had helped him find still sat to the side, streaked with frost. Inside the cavity, the bundle of letters safely wrapped in oilcloth, now joined by something else, a photo. Eleanor. Red Elk. The girl. He'd stared at the picture half the night, trying to decipher something from the way they stood. Not just history, but a connection. The girl's eyes especially direct, calm, curious. He couldn't shake the thought that maybe she'd seen this same view. Maybe she'd stood where he now stood, watching the fog rise off the ridges. Caleb ran his fingers along the bottom edge of the wall, clearing away ice and debris. The letters had been hidden, yes, but something still nagged at him. There had to be more. Eleanor had built a life here. Not temporary, not improvised, intentional. She hadn't just survived, she'd designed this space. The journal said so. The letters said so. And she'd been a builder. She'd left something. He stood, brushed off his knees, and walked the perimeter of the structure again. Slowly, deliberately. This time he brought light, a headlamp strapped across his forehead, the beam scanning every crevice. The stones had settled over time. Some were cracked, some loose. But one tucked into the base of the rear corner was off, slightly smaller, smoother. It didn't match the coarse granite that made up the rest of the structure. It was foreign. His breath caught. "The stone that doesn't belong," he whispered. He crouched, examined it more closely. The stone was dark red, almost rust-colored. Sandstone, maybe. He touched the edges. Cold, smooth, no lichen. It had been placed, not weathered, a deliberate insert like a bookmark. With both hands he braced and pulled. The stone came free with a groan. Behind it was a second cavity deeper than the first. His headlamp beam caught the edges of something wrapped in canvas. Not paper. He reached inside with slow hands and pulled it free. It was heavier than he expected. Inside, a narrow ledger book. Brown canvas cover. Metal clasp. The clasp popped open with a soft snap. He unfolded the pages. Not letters. Not a journal. Blueprints. Drawings. Measurements. Diagrams. Each page held notes in Eleanor's tight, deliberate script. Angles of sunlight across months. Thermal retention diagrams. Stone densities. Sketches of a cabin walls integrating directly into the ruin, a chimney built not just for venting, but for heating stone from the inside out. It was a manual, a complete record of how she'd built her shelter, how she'd used the bones of the settlement to amplify warmth, block wind, catch light, how she'd learned to survive on 4 cords of wood when the valley families burned 10. Some pages had notations in red ink corrections experiments that had failed redesigned corners. She'd been building toward something. He sat down in the middle of the ruin, the book open in his lap, and read until the cold began to creep up his spine. Colt lay beside him, head on paws, ears twitching with the breeze. Caleb turned another page. Here Eleanor had written something in bold across the top: "Some things don't rot. Some truths are too stubborn to die." It wasn't instruction anymore. It was legacy. She hadn't hidden this out of fear someone would destroy it. She'd hidden it because she believed someone would need it. Eventually. Someone like him. The wind stirred and the fire he'd built earlier crackled against the stone. He watched the flames dance in the light reflected off the granite, and he began to understand what Tommy had meant. This wasn't just a ruin. It was a repository. Knowledge stored in stone. He turned the last page. Tucked into the back cover was a folded sheet of tracing paper, brittle with age. Unfolding it, he found a final drawing, a cabin fully integrated into the ruins with glass facing south and stone shielding the north. A note in Eleanor's handwriting at the bottom read, "Build this if you plan to stay. If you just need to rest, the walls will hold you. But if you need to live, build." Caleb stared at the drawing for a long time, then folded it gently and slid it back into place. He stood and moved to the southern opening. Outside, the day was fading gold light, dropping between the trees. The temperature had shifted again, and clouds were crawling back over the ridgelines like slow creatures. Another storm was coming. This one bigger. He'd need to reinforce the shelter, collect more firewood, ration carefully. But first he had to protect what he'd found. He gathered the letters, the blueprint ledger, and the photograph. He wrapped them again in oilcloth, double this time, and slid them back into the cavity behind the sandstone block, then replaced the stone, carefully anchoring it with 2 wedges. It fit tight, sealed with a few thin fingers of frozen moss. He stepped back, brushing snow from his knees, and looked at the wall. No one would know, unless they were meant to. That night, the snow came hard. The wind screamed across the ridge, rattling the tarp Caleb had stretched over the wall gap. The fire held as long as it could, but eventually the cold bled through. He pulled Colt close, wrapped in every layer he had. The blueprint sat inside his coat, pressed to his chest, protected. He didn't sleep, not really. But as the wind howled and the snow beat against the walls, he wasn't afraid. The stone held. And tomorrow he'd start thinking about what it meant to build. Because this place wasn't just ruins. It was a foundation. When morning came, muted and gray, the fire had burned low, but the warmth inside the walls still held, faint but real. He lit a second one, made coffee, shared a few strips of jerky with Colt. Then, for the first time since arriving, he sat down with a blank notebook of his own and began to sketch, overlaying his thoughts on Eleanor's. Modifying some things, adding others, adapting. Outside, the snow had stopped, but in the silence that followed, the wind had left a message in its wake, and Caleb was ready to start listening. Tomorrow he would hike east again toward Coldwater Creek, toward the smoke Tommy had seen, toward whoever still carried the memory of Red Elk. Because if he was going to rebuild, he needed more than knowledge. He needed roots, and someone out there knew the rest of the story. The river wasn't marked on any map Caleb had studied, but it ran with a sound like old voices, low, steady, familiar. He followed it upstream for miles past fallen trees and half-buried tracks, his boots sinking through snow softened by afternoon sun. Colt stayed close alert, reading the land, with the quiet precision of a creature who didn't need language to understand warning signs. The blueprint Eleanor had drawn was still folded in Caleb's coat pocket, worn from being unfolded and studied over and over. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. There were markings she'd used, symbols, notes written in shorthand he didn't fully understand. And the letters had made it clear someone had helped her learn this, someone who hadn't come from books. Now Caleb was following smoke. Not just metaphorical. Real. He'd seen it the day before, thin and dark, curling over the far ridge near Coldwater Creek. Too far for a casual fire. Too controlled for lightning or accident. Someone was living up here. Maybe seasonal. Maybe permanent. He didn't know, but he hoped. The forest changed as he climbed. The pines grew taller, more tightly packed, and the trail disappeared entirely. He paused to scan the slope ahead, and that's when he saw her, standing not 50 yards away. A woman in a thick wool coat holding a bow across her body like an extension of herself. Her hair was braided black, streaked with silver. She looked straight at him without flinching. Colt stopped in his tracks. So did Caleb. The woman didn't move, didn't raise her weapon. She studied him like she already knew why he was there. Caleb raised his hands slowly, palms out. "I'm not lost," he said, voice calm, "but I'm looking for someone." The woman said nothing. Then, after a long moment, she spoke. "I know." Her voice was low, grounded, not unfriendly, but not open either. Just matter of fact. "You're Eleanor Holt's blood." It wasn't a question. Caleb nodded, throat suddenly tight. "I am." She gestured with her chin. "Come on. I'm not going to shoot you." He followed her through a narrow break in the trees and into a clearing. A small canvas tent sat beneath a makeshift lean-to. Smoke rose from a metal stovepipe rigged into the fire pit. Bundles of dried herbs hung from a branch, and a rabbit carcass lay skinned on a wooden table. She crouched beside the fire and added a split log. The flames licked higher. "I'm June," she said, Red Elk was my grandfather. Caleb didn't know what to say. Every response felt too formal, too small, so he just sat down on a fallen log and nodded. I read about him, he said finally, in Eleanor's letters. June gave him a sharp look. You found the letters, I found everything Caleb said. The journal, the wall, her plans. He pulled the blueprint from his coat and handed it over. June unfolded it slowly, her expression unreadable. She drew this when I was a kid, she said. He used to help her figure out airflow in the chimney. Taught her how to watch the sun across the seasons. She wrote about you too, Caleb said. Not by name, just the girl who came in summer. June smiled faintly. I was loud back then, always running through her garden. She said I scared the carrots out of the ground. They both laughed soft and real. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that held weight without pressing down. She taught me how to listen to the mountain, June said. Not fight it. Not try to control it. Caleb nodded. That's why I'm here. You think the mountain will heal you? I think it's the only place that hasn't tried to change me. June studied him again, her eyes narrowing slightly. You don't own the land just because you survive it, she said. You have to give something back. I'm trying to, he said. I want to rebuild her cabin, properly, the way she meant it to be. June looked away toward the trees. She waited for someone, she said. I always thought it was foolish. Now I'm not so sure. They sat for a while, the fire snapping between them. June stirred a pot of something thick and rich beans, dried meat, wild onion. Eat, she said. Caleb didn't argue. As they ate, June pointed out subtle things, how the wind shifted when birds fell silent, where the frost line crept during colder weeks, which trees bent first under snowfall. Things you didn't read in books, things Eleanor had learned over time and passed down without ceremony. Caleb felt it settle into his bones, the rhythm of the place, the rightness of learning like this. Not with theory, but with observation, repetition, presence. You're not afraid of winter, he asked. June shook her head. I'm afraid of people who think they can outsmart it. After they ate, she handed him a pouch of dried plants. For tea, she said, will help when the cold sinks in too deep. Not a cure, but it helps. Caleb took it like an offering, like inheritance. He stood after a while, Colt stretching beside him. Thank you, he said. June didn't smile, but she nodded. You're not done yet, she said. The walls are memory, but the roof, that's intention. He blinked. What do you mean you want to stay, she said. That means you're not sheltering anymore. You're claiming. That roof has to hold. He felt the words in his chest. Heavy. True. June looked at him one more time, then turned back to her camp. Build it. Then come back, I will, he said. As Caleb and Colt walked back through the trees, snow began to fall again, light and soft. He thought about June's words, about Eleanor's plans, about Red Elk's knowledge passed on like breath. He reached the ruins by nightfall. The wind had picked up again, but the walls still held. He lit a fire, made tea from the pouch June gave him, and sat against the west wall. The fire danced. The stones warmed. Tomorrow he would start to build the roof. Not just for shelter, for permanence. The first beam broke when Caleb tried to force it into the corner post too fast. He cursed under his breath as the wood split, the sharp crack echoing against the stone walls. Colt raised his head from where he lay in the shade, ears twitching. Caleb exhaled hard, wiped sweat from his brow, and looked around at the ruin that now resembled a workshop more than a shelter. Scraps of lumber, a coil of salvaged wire, and hand tools scavenged from a nearby ranger station sat neatly along the interior wall. The smell of pitch and sawdust filled the space, foreign, at first now familiar. It was the 4th day since he'd returned from seeing June. 4 days of measuring, cutting, hauling, of sleeping with frozen hands and aching shoulders, of reading Eleanor's plans by firelight, tracing her pencil strokes with his fingers like they were scripture. And still he couldn't get the angles right. He picked up the broken beam and stared at it like it had betrayed him. "You don't fight the mountain," he muttered. "You fold yourself into it." Eleanor's words. But he'd forgotten what they meant the second he started treating the project like a deadline. He sat down on a rock near the fire pit and took a long drink from his canteen. The late October sun hung low, casting gold across the southern opening of the ruin. The wind was light, brushing against him, with a breath that felt almost thoughtful. He pulled out her blueprint again. The roof wasn't just a cover. It was an extension of the walls, angled to catch snow in drifts that would insulate, sloped to let meltwater run toward the back where Eleanor had once buried catch basins, framed with short-span beams staggered to avoid wind shear. She hadn't just built it. She'd listened. Caleb stood slowly and walked to the corner post. He adjusted the footing, slightly shifted the base stone just a few inches inward. Suddenly the angle made sense. The second beam fit snugly across the span. He smiled without meaning to. Colt grunted his approval and laid his head back down. The rest of the day passed in rhythm, sawing, fitting, securing. By dusk, Caleb had framed nearly half the roof structure. Temporary for now, reinforced tarp would cover it until spring, but the bones were right, just like Eleanor had done it. He lit a fire and heated a pot of soup. As he ate, he wrote notes in a small notebook of his own details. Eleanor hadn't covered things he'd learned by failing first. The moon rose early, the valley fell quiet, and the ruin began to feel smaller. Not in a bad way, in a lived-in way. He'd never realized how silence changed when it belonged to you. That night, a light snow fell again. Caleb laid in his sleeping bag, Colt curled beside him, and stared up at the roof frame above, just the beams silhouetted against moonlight, like ribs of some ancient creature. He thought about June's words. The walls are memory, but the roof, that's intention. He understood now. Walls were for protection, but a roof meant you were staying. Over the next 2 days, Caleb built with more confidence. He scavenged large flat stones to reinforce the north side. He layered tarp between wooden slats to create an insulating barrier. It wasn't pretty, but it held. He installed a stovepipe through a hole in the rear wall exactly where Eleanor had placed hers. Tommy had helped haul the heavy iron stove into the ruin weeks earlier, grumbling the whole way but secretly pleased. Caleb fired it up that afternoon. The warmth was immediate. Not just heat, but presence. The stone walls absorbed it slowly, then began to give it back. By that night, the temperature inside the ruin stayed above freezing for the first time since he arrived. He cooked fresh rabbit seasoned with dried juniper June had given him. The meat was tough but good, real. Afterward, he sat in the glow of firelight reading Eleanor's journal again. One line stood out. "This place isn't a sanctuary. It's a contract. If you care for it, it will hold you. If you don't, it will bury you." He read it 3 times. She wasn't just writing about shelter. She was writing about commitment. The stone didn't offer forgiveness, only memory, only return. The roof creaked softly in the wind, holding breathing with the structure. That night, Caleb dreamed he was walking through snow toward a figure on the ridge. He couldn't see her face, but her posture was familiar, strong, grounded. She turned toward him and raised a hand. He woke before she spoke. Colt was already up, ears forward. Someone was coming. Caleb grabbed his coat and stepped into his boots, crossing the ruin quickly. At the edge of the southern gap, he saw movement through the trees. A silhouette. Then a voice. "Didn't think you'd listen." June. She stepped into the clearing wrapped in a thick coat, her cheeks flushed from the climb. Caleb laughed under his breath. "Didn't think you'd check." She scanned the roof, the stovepipe, the firelight glowing behind him. "You built it," she said. He nodded. "I'm not here to camp." She stepped forward, boots crunching frost, and placed something into his hand. It was a small carved talisman wood smoothed by time. A spiral, simple but elegant. "My grandfather carved this," she said. "Said it was for balance, for places that listen." Caleb turned it over in his palm. "Why give it to me?" June looked around. "Because this place remembers. And now it remembers you, too." They stood together in silence for a while, firelight flickering behind them, wind moving gently through the roof beams. Then June turned to go. "Come back in spring," Caleb said. She paused. "If the roof's still standing." "It will be." As she disappeared into the trees, Caleb returned to the fire talisman in hand. He hung it from a nail above the stove. A symbol. Not decoration. A declaration. He looked around the space stone wood flame silence and felt for the first time not like a visitor, but like someone who belonged. Tomorrow he would begin building out the insulation, the vestibule. Spring would come fast, and the mountain didn't wait. But tonight the roof held, and so did he. The storm hit just after midnight. Caleb woke to the sound of wind slamming into the ridge like a freight train. The walls groaned under pressure, but held. The tarp lining the roof snapped like sails in high wind, and snow began pushing sideways through the gaps in the beam joints, riding the gale like needles. He sat up fast, boots already half on from habit. Colt was up too, pacing tight circles, nose pressed to the ground, body tense. The air had changed. It wasn't just cold, it was sharp. Like the mountain had stopped tolerating their presence and decided to remind them who was in charge. He grabbed his headlamp and threw on his coat. The stove was still burning low from earlier, but the wind was pulling heat out faster than the stones could return it. He tossed 3 more logs in, cranked the vent open, and braced the stovepipe with a crossbar he'd prepared days ago for this exact situation. Outside snow lashed across the gap like white fire. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an hour. Inside the shelter, the fire was losing ground. "Cold's not the killer," Eleanor had written in her journal. "Not listening is." Caleb ran inventory in his head. Firewood, 2 cords inside, more in the pile under tarp. Food, dry goods, some preserved rabbit lentils, tea from June. Water, 2 5-gallon containers, and the spring down the hill hadn't frozen yet, not fully. The roof creaked. He stepped outside the vestibule and into the full fury of the wind. It nearly knocked him sideways. He fought through it, reaching the north corner where the tarp had begun to peel. He drove in another anchor rock and tied it tighter. His fingers went numb within minutes. When he returned inside, his beard was stiff with frost. Colt lay by the fire, shivering. Caleb pulled out his extra wool blanket and wrapped the dog tight, whispering nonsense, just sounds comfort. Anything to ground them both. He stripped off his outer layers and warmed his hands by the stove. The temperature inside was now just above 35 degrees. Dangerous if it kept falling. He fed the fire again. Checked the ceiling. No leaks. No collapse. But the storm wasn't going anywhere. The wind didn't rise and fall, it stayed high, endless. Caleb could feel it in his bones, in his teeth. He moved everything closer to the stove. Sleeping bag, tools, food packs, Colt. They huddled in the corner like settlers in a siege. Time stretched strange. The storm blurred everything. He didn't sleep. Not really. He listened. To the wind. To the way the walls responded, flexing slightly, giving just enough like an old house breathing. The mountain didn't want to kill him. It just wanted to be heard. He thought about June. He wondered if she was hunkered down too deeper in the forest, riding out the same storm. At one point, hours later, he had no idea how many he drifted into a half-sleep. And in it, he dreamed of Eleanor. She was standing in the same corner he was curled in, tending a fire, hair streaked with snow, eyes calm. She didn't speak. She just handed him a piece of stone warm from the hearth. When he woke, his fire had burned low, but not out. The temperature inside hovered at 42 degrees. He was winning. Barely. The storm raged for 2 more days. He rationed wood carefully, watching the pile shrink, but never panic. He cooked once a day, boiled tea, constantly melted snow in the pan on the stove for Colt to drink. Every few hours he would tap the inside walls, feeling for cold spots. The stone radiated heat like a slow breath. It was working. The roof held. The walls held. He held. On the 3rd morning, light pierced through the tarp like a blade. The wind dropped. Snow settled. Silence returned, slow and heavy. He stepped outside just after dawn. The world was white. 3 feet of snow blanketed the ridge. Drifts reached to the top of the stone walls. Trees bowed under the weight branches, cracking in the distance like distant gunfire. But the cabin stood. No sagging. No collapse. He turned in a slow circle, breath steaming in the cold. He hadn't just survived. He'd built something that survived with him. He walked the perimeter, checking every anchor, every joint. Minor damage. 1 tarp flap blown loose. Nothing worse. Colt bounded through the snow beside him, energized by the light tongue lolling as if nothing had happened. He paused near the tree line, ears alert. Caleb followed his gaze but saw nothing. Still, something in the air had shifted. Not threat. Just movement. Possibility. Back inside, he sat by the stove and wrote the date in his journal. Then beneath it, a note: storm held for 56 hours. Internal temp never dropped below 40. Used approx. 3/4 cord of wood. Re-roof west seam in spring. He paused, then added another line. Didn't feel alone. He looked around the space, the roof, the stove, the stone, the fire. It felt like a room now, a place, a home. That afternoon, he added a small shelf beside the stove. On it, he placed the carved spiral talisman June had given him. Balance. A reminder that survival wasn't about fighting. It was about listening, responding, adapting. He stepped outside one more time before nightfall. The air was crisp and dry. No wind. The snow glowed in the last of the golden light. He thought about the next step. Insulation. Storage. A place for water barrels. And something else, something bigger. He had the plans Eleanor left. He had his own now. His own measurements, sketches, adjustments. Her legacy wasn't a monument. It was a conversation. A blueprint that evolved. He was part of that now. Inside, the fire crackled low, calm, and rhythmic. Colt curled up on his bedroll without being told. Caleb poured tea, sat back, and let the warmth seep into his hands. He wasn't afraid of winter anymore. It didn't mean he'd won. It just meant he understood the terms. And tomorrow, he'd write down everything he'd learned, not just for himself, but for the next person who would stand on this ridge, look at these stones, and wonder if they could stay. Because now he knew the answer. They could. If they listened. The snow had settled into silence by the time Caleb found the stone basin. It was half buried behind the rear wall of the ruin, exposed only after he shoveled back several feet of drift to check on the drainage path Eleanor had marked in her plans. The corner was shaded all day, untouched by sun, and when the shovel struck something solid beneath the crust, it rang out with a dull chonk that echoed through the stillness like a struck bell. He knelt down, brushing away packed snow and brittle pine needles until the edge of the basin revealed itself. It was round, shallow, carved from a single block of granite, stained dark in places with soot and something older. Inside, covered by a sheet of ice, lay the twisted remnants of iron, charred, blackened, half-melted. He stared at it for a long time before realizing what it was. An old stove, or what was left of one. Maybe the first one Eleanor had used before the cast iron model. Or maybe it belonged to someone who lived in these ruins long before even she had arrived. It didn't matter. What mattered was what surrounded it. Marks, carvings in the stone nearby. He chipped away the ice slowly, not with tools, but with his hands melting snow, with body heat, breathing warmth into frost. And then the shapes emerged like secrets rising through time. Spirals, arrows, wind lines, symbols, and numbers. Tiny etched coordinates, angular notations, notes in Eleanor's handwriting. She had used this basin as more than a place to burn wood. It had been her field lab, her blueprint board. He pulled out his notebook and began sketching every symbol, every direction, replicating her layout as precisely as he could. The symbols weren't random. They echoed what was in her manual, the airflows, the insulation strategies, the techniques to maximize heat retention with minimal effort. But more than that, the stone felt alive. Even here, generations after its purpose had faded. Even when we burn it all down, the bones remember. He didn't know if that thought was his or Eleanor's, but it didn't matter. It was true. When he finished sketching, he sat back against the stone and just breathed. The snow had stopped entirely. The sun hovered just above the ridgeline, casting long gold fingers across the basin. The ruin behind him stood quiet and still, its roof intact, fire glowing faintly inside. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not Eleanor's blueprint, this time his version. Lined with updated measurements, scribbled corrections, modern insulation notes, ideas for a vestibule storage racks, a rain catchment system. He held the two side by side, his plan and hers. A conversation across a century. Two lives that had never met, both etched in pencil and fire. He flipped to a clean page and began writing something else. Not blueprints. A letter. Not to anyone in particular. Just the next one. Whoever they'd be. If you're reading this, it means the blood found its way home. He paused. The words came easier after that. He told the truth. About how he'd arrived here broken. About the silence that had scared him at first, and then saved him. About Colt. About the storm. About Tommy and the stove. About June. About the stone that didn't belong. He didn't try to sound wise. He just told what he knew. You don't have to be ready to come here. You just have to be honest. With yourself, with the mountain. This place doesn't care if you're broken, but it won't lie to you either. It'll show you what you are. Then it'll wait to see what you'll do with that. He folded the letter when he was done, slid it into a fresh oilcloth packet, and tucked it into a cavity beneath the stone basin. Not hidden, not obvious, just waiting like Eleanor's had waited for him. Then he took a piece of charcoal from the fire and knelt beside the granite. Beside Eleanor's symbols, he etched a new one, a spiral intersected by a single vertical line. Balance and direction, his mark, not to overwrite hers, to stand beside it, to add. That evening he cooked a real meal: lentils, dried meat, and a bit of foraged root June had taught him to recognize. Colt hovered near, tail thumping. The air inside the cabin felt different now, not just warmer, lived in. He lit a second candle and propped it near the basin so the symbols glowed faintly in the firelight. His hands were sore, his shoulders ached, but he felt right. That night, as the wind whispered over the ridge, he added the last line to his journal for the day she built the beginning. I'm building the middle. Let someone else finish it. He slept deeply. No dreams, just warmth. And in the morning, after coffee and checking the stovepipe, he packed a small day bag with supplies and marked the trail toward Tommy's cabin. He needed hinges, some nails, and news from the world below. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to share what he'd found. Not because he was done building, but because it was time someone else knew it could be done. He left the fire burning low behind him. The spiral above the stove spun gently in the updraft, catching the morning light. The stone basin watched from its corner, and the mountain waited for spring. The first thing Caleb noticed when he reached Tommy's place was that the front door was ajar. Not wide open, just enough to be wrong. In the mountains, nothing is left half done. A door is either closed or it's not, especially in February. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, Colt stiffening beside him. The snow had drifted around the porch untouched. No recent boot tracks. The smoke pipe was dark. No smell of firewood or fresh ash. Caleb lowered his pack slowly and moved forward, boots crunching over the crusted snow. He knocked once on the frame. Nothing. Again, louder. Tommy, silence. He stepped inside. The room was cold, the fire long dead. A half-melted cup of something sat on the table rimmed with ice. The lantern on the hook above the stove was still full, untouched. But Caleb didn't feel panic. Just pause. He walked the perimeter of the cabin, eyes scanning for signs of struggle damage, anything out of place. The radio was unplugged. The emergency pack was missing. A note lay on the cot. He picked it up, read quickly. Caleb went down to Ridgeville. Supplies low. Snow's clearing by the highway might be the only window before March. Back in a week. If you're reading this, take what you need. T. Caleb exhaled, part laugh, part relief. Of course. Tommy was many things: grumpy, skeptical, always suspicious of old ways, but he was still reliable. Winter had cracked just long enough for a supply run, and he hadn't wasted the chance. Still, something about the silence in the room stuck with Caleb. It wasn't emptiness, it was suspended time. A space paused mid-thought. He realized how much he'd changed because a few months ago he'd have envied this simplicity. Now it just felt hollow. He made himself a cup of tea using the small propane burner in the corner. It was strange being in someone else's space again. Even stranger realizing it felt like someone else's space. The cabin was neat, well-stocked, built solid, but lifeless. There was no spiral, no stone basin, no memory in the walls. Just a man and his habits. He stayed long enough to warm up and jot a note in return. Tommy took hinges, nails, and a flask of oil. The roof held. More than that. I think I'm staying for good. See, he left the note on the table, packed what he came for, and stepped back into the cold. The hike back was easier than the way in. The trail was packed down the wind low, the sun cutting through gray cloud layers like thin gold threads. Colt trotted ahead, tail high, eager to return. At the ridgeline, Caleb paused, turned. For the first time since arriving months ago, he didn't feel like he was going back to isolation. He felt like he was going home. By late afternoon, he reached the clearing. His cabin now stood quiet smoke curling gently from the stovepipe. The spiral above the door caught the breeze and spun once, then stilled. Inside the fire still held a low core of embers. He added wood, tightened the damper, and began organizing the supplies. The hinges would go on the new door. The nails would secure the shelving he'd planned. The oil for the saw blade already beginning to rust from snowmelt. He moved with purpose now. Not frantic, not trying to prove anything. Just building, like breathing. That night the wind rose again, but softer this time. More like a sigh than a scream. Caleb sat by the fire, Colt asleep at his feet, and opened Eleanor's journal to the page where she'd written, "If you treat the land like it's waiting to take something from you, it will. But if you ask what it needs, it'll show you." He flipped to a blank page and wrote, "The land needed listening, so did I." Then he folded up another letter, a second one, for the basin, a continuation. Not because the first was incomplete, but because he had changed since writing it. To whoever comes next, the walls will protect you, the fire will warm you. But the silence, that's where you'll hear the truth. Listen close. You'll hear her in the stone. You'll hear yourself too. Don't leave too soon. Caleb M. Holt. He folded it carefully and slid it into his coat. Tomorrow he'd take it out to the basin, bury it beside the first, and maybe next week he'd leave a third. He didn't know. He just knew he wasn't waiting for rescue anymore. He stood and stepped to the door, cracking it open to let in a sliver of cold. The stars were out, clear, bright, scattered like ash across velvet. His breath curled in front of him. There was a kind of permission in the air, like the mountain had finally accepted him as part of the landscape. Then movement. A small figure approaching through the trees. He froze. It was June. She moved slowly, methodically, not hurried. Her hair was tied back and her bow was strapped across her back. She was smiling before she even reached the edge of the clearing. "You built a door," she said. He nodded heart-light. "And you came back." She stepped onto the porch, looking up at the beamwork, the shelf with firewood stacked neatly beneath the awning. "I brought you something," she said, pulling a bundle from her pack. It was a weathered roll of parchment, older than Eleanor's drawings, worn and fragile. Caleb unfurled it carefully, eyes scanning. It wasn't a blueprint. It was a map, not just of the mountain, but of the surrounding ridges, marked with sites, settlements, ancient trails, water sources, and symbols, dozens of them matched to those carved into the stone basin. It was Red Elk's, June said. He mapped what the mountain remembered. Caleb swallowed. This wasn't the end of a journey. It was the beginning of a deeper one. June set her pack down. "I'm not staying," she said, "but I'll help you mark it, if you're ready." He looked around. At the walls, the fire, the stone. "I am." They stood in silence for a long moment, the spiral above them turning gently in the breeze. Then she nodded once. "Let's begin." The map Red Elk had drawn was a web of forgotten memory. By late morning, June had laid it across the work table in the cabin, smoothing the curled edges with small stones. Caleb hovered beside her journal, open pencil in hand. Outside wind rustled the trees, gentler now, as if the mountain was listening in. Symbols crowded the yellowing parchment spirals, waves crude arrows and points marked in charcoal black. Some had faded nearly to dust, but June had retraced the clearest ones in red ink. Red Elk didn't write much, she explained, but every mark has meaning. He followed the land's memory. Its breath, he called it. Caleb studied the lines that radiated outward from their ridge like veins. Each path seemed to lead to a different layer of something lost. An old homestead, a collapsed shelter, a seasonal spring, or a memory that didn't exist in books. "What's this one?" he asked, pointing to a heavy mark etched just southwest of their location, surrounded by a ring. June hesitated. "That's the crossing tree." Caleb waited, but she didn't elaborate. "Should we start there?" he asked. She gave a short nod. "If you're ready." They left just after midday, packs light, but layered colt trotting beside them. The snow had softened under the sun, packed firm enough for easy walking, but not yet melting into the spring flood it promised. The hike to the tree took them down the back slope past a creek barely thawed, and along a trail that looked more like a suggestion than a path. June moved easily through the terrain, every step placed with familiarity. Caleb followed close, noting her rhythm, not just how she walked, but how she listened. She paused often, touched bark, sniffed the air, like reading a living book. 2 hours in, they reached it. The crossing tree was ancient. Split at the center like lightning had cleaved it decades ago, its upper trunk now bent horizontally, forming a crude natural arch. Beneath it, someone Red Elk, or perhaps someone even earlier, had placed a ring of stones, each etched with spirals. Caleb ducked beneath the arch and stood in the circle. The air shifted. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't colder. It wasn't warmer. But it felt different. More aware. "What was this?" he asked. June answered from the edge. "A place of remembering. For travelers who didn't come back. For the ones who couldn't stay." She stepped inside too slowly. "Some believe the mountain keeps part of you when you walk through. The part that was lost." He looked at the stones. All different sizes, no names, no dates, just spirals, like Eleanor's, like his own. He crouched and ran his hand across one. The grooves were shallow but precise, not worn, maintained. June sat cross-legged across from him. "Red Elk taught me that not all memory needs words. Some of it is weight. Some is what you choose to carry." Caleb nodded, still running his fingers along the stone. "What we pass down isn't just blood," he said quietly. "It's what we choose to carry forward." June looked at him, then not with surprise, but recognition, like he'd said something she'd once thought, but never spoken. "You get it now," she said. He did. They stayed there for a long time, neither speaking, just breathing with the wind. When they finally rose, Caleb left behind a stone of his own smooth dark, taken from the base of the basin wall. He carved a single spiral into it, with his knife not perfect, but real. He placed it gently beside the others. Not for himself. For Eleanor. On the hike back, they marked trees with chalk using Red Elk's symbols. Trail signs for those who might follow one day, if not soon, then someday. They stopped to drink from a melt-fed stream, the water shockingly cold and clean. Caleb filled his thermos and watched the current swirl past a fallen branch. I used to think surviving meant fighting, he said. And now, June asked, now I think it means making room for what's real, for what's worth keeping. Back at the cabin, dusk was settling fast. Caleb lit the fire while June placed the map in the shelf they'd cleared just for it. Above it, she hung a carved wooden plate marked with 2 spirals joined at the edge. That was his last symbol, she said. Red Elk carved it before he died. He told me, memory is meant to spiral out, not inward. Caleb touched the edge of the carving. It felt warm even in the cold. That night they shared dinner in quiet comfort, roasted root vegetables, dried venison, and a pot of tea steeped with pine needles and wild mint. Colt curled between them, snoring softly. Afterward they sat by the fire journal's open pages rustling as they wrote. Caleb wrote not to record, but to remember to fix the feeling of the tree, the way the silence had spoken, the way June had waited for him to understand, without forcing it. Outside the wind shifted again, a colder front returning. But he wasn't afraid of it. Not anymore. He closed his journal and looked toward the door. We'll need better hinges before spring melt, he said. June smiled. Then we better find the old forge tomorrow. He raised a brow. There's a forge? Of course, she said, standing to stretch. But it's not where you'd expect, and not everyone finds it. The fire popped behind them. Are we going to find it? He asked. June didn't answer immediately. She walked to the map, tapped the edge near the north ridge where the lines didn't quite line up. There, she said. But we'll need to listen carefully. To what? She turned back to him. The part of the mountain that still remembers fire. Snowmelt whispered in the creeks. It wasn't loud yet, not the roaring thaw of April, but the kind that made you pause while walking. The kind that reminded you everything was shifting, even if it hadn't told you so outright. Caleb stood at the edge of the ridge with June beside him, the spring sun soaking through the last of winter's frost. Below the trees were starting to breathe green again. Just barely buds curled tight, waiting for one more warm day to uncurl. But the promise was there. They'd found the forge 2 days ago, hidden behind a split in the rock marked by 2 spirals etched into a narrow slab. It wasn't what he'd expected, no chimney, no bellows, no anvil sitting in wait. Just stones blackened by time shaped into a half circle. Old tools rusted into the soil. A flat surface that had once known fire. And beside it, a small wooden crate dry inside packed with coiled wire and wedges wrapped in oilcloth. Eleanor's name was carved faintly into the lid. He hadn't opened it right away. Instead, he'd sat in silence. Let the memory of it unfold. He could almost feel her hands there, setting things aside for someone she didn't know, for someone she'd never meet. But she'd trusted the mountain would send the right person. He wasn't sure he'd ever truly earn that kind of faith, but he could live in the direction of it. That morning they'd brought back what they could carry, nails, a rusted plane, a set of chisels still sharp enough to bite. He'd polished them carefully, cleaned the rust with oil and stone. As he worked, he thought about hands, how many had held these tools before him. How many had chosen to repair instead of discard, to build instead of abandon. Now they stood watching the snow recede like a tide. I always thought spring was loud, Caleb said, but this feels patient. June tilted her head. It's a slow return. The mountain doesn't rush. Maybe people shouldn't either. She smiled. Some don't. They made their way back to the cabin, slowly stopping to clear branches to mark new paths that had appeared where snow had once hidden them. Colt trotted ahead, fur damp, happy. Inside the cabin was warm, Not just from fire, but from rhythm. A rhythm Caleb had learned to build and let build him in return. He moved through the space like someone who belonged, not someone squatting in survival, not someone running, but someone living. He placed the forged tools on the shelf he'd built the week before, joined corners cedar backing. Not perfect, but nothing about this place asked for perfection. Just honesty. On the wall now hung 3 spirals, one carved by Eleanor, one he'd made in charcoal and sealed with beeswax, and the new one June had painted 2 loops interwoven hers and his. Above the mantel he'd written one sentence on a piece of reclaimed wood. We remember forward, not back, not just, because memory wasn't only about preservation. It was about passing on what mattered. He sat down to write his final letter. Not final as in last, but final as in full. To the one who comes after. This place is still here because someone believed it was worth leaving behind. Not as a monument, but as a message. Not all broken things stay broken, and not every silence is empty. If you're here, then maybe you needed to remember something you forgot you knew. Or maybe you needed to be reminded that healing isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It builds slow and real. Like roots, take care of this place, leave something behind, build forward, we remember forward. Caleb M. Holt, he folded it gently, slid it into a tin with the other letters and placed them back beneath the stone basin. That same basin now cleaned, sealed, and lined with symbols. Not just Eleanor's. His too. June's. Red Elk's. A layered map of belief and proof. Before sealing it, he paused, then added one more line. What we pass down isn't just blood. It's what we choose to carry forward. He closed the tin fingers resting on the cool metal for a moment longer than necessary. Not as a goodbye, but as a promise. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, June stepped onto the porch. She held 2 mugs, pine tea and wild mint, and handed one to him. They sat in silence, watching the light fade to amber. I think I'm heading back soon, she said quietly. The valley needs hands for planting. He nodded. You'll be back. She didn't argue, because they both knew she would. And even if she didn't, what she gave here remained. After she left the next morning, Caleb stayed on the porch a long time, thinking, listening. The mountain no longer sounded empty. Birdsong returned in flickers. Melting ice sang under stone. The wind carried scents instead of warnings, mud moss, the beginning of green. A rhythm, a life, a home. And beneath it all, the memory of those who'd come before Eleanor Red Elk June, and whoever else had walked these trails before names were written down. He stood and walked inside. Colt followed, tail wagging once. The fire still burned. The roof still held. The tools were ready. Tomorrow he'd begin clearing the north path. He wasn't sure what he'd find. Maybe another ruin. Maybe nothing. But it didn't matter. He wasn't looking for proof anymore. He was building because it mattered. Because someone might follow. And even if no one ever did, he'd still build. Because this was enough. Because he was enough. Later that night before sleep, he stepped back outside one last time. The stars shimmered in a sky so clear it hurt. Cold air filled his lungs, crisp and alive. He looked up at the spiral above the door. It turned once, then stilled. And in that stillness, Caleb smiled. Not an ending, a continuation.